what I'm not sure about is if I don't have it in presenter mode yet. So let me just, do you know if I share it to PowerPoint and then press present, it will still be sharing?
I think so, yeah.
Okay.
Well, I'll be able to see if it's sharing or not, so.
Okay. So you should see everything. And now.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so this is it on presenter mode, so yeah, that's fine. I'm gonna put myself on mute so that you don't hear any noises, and then you just start whenever you want to.
Okay, hello. Thank you everyone for coming to our talk today. I'm Sydney Williams, and I'm currently a postdoctoral research associate at the University of Glasgow, and I work in a special center called the Imaging Center of Excellence. And today I'm going to talk about MRI. But before we begin with MRI in general, I kind of want to talk to you about the bigger concept of medical imaging. Medical imaging is a really powerful diagnostic tool because it allows us to see inside the human body without cutting us open. You don't need a scalpel. And on this screen, you can see some of the most common categories of medical imaging modalities, they're called. And front and center, we see an X-ray or radiography, which everyone I think is mostly familiar with. And this is a common use for it is a chest X-ray. And then on the right, we also see what people commonly are aware of for fetal imaging, ultrasound. In the bottom right corner, we see MRI, which we'll talk a little bit more about today. And that's a picture of the brain. Then another type of medical imaging that is pretty common, we hear about a CT scan or CAT scan, and that's in the category of tomography. And then a little bit more specialized is nuclear medicine, which includes PET and SPECT scans, among others. And in general, here in Glasgow, we've always kind of been very at the forefront of medical imaging and its technology, because the whole field started across the world with the discovery of the X-ray, and that was in 1895 by a German scientist, Wilhelm Conrad Röntgen. And already by just the year later in 1896, the first radiology department in the world was opened in the Glasgow Royal Infirmary. And another really big advancement that took place in the field of medical imaging here in Glasgow was the discovery of ultrasound for use in obstetrics. So what we now commonly think is everyday practice in pregnancy, the scanning of a baby with ultrasound, this happened with the University of Glasgow professor Ian Donald. So coming back to all these modalities, we're just going to focus in today on this bottom right one here, MRI, magnetic resonance imaging. And an MRI scanner is maybe a quite intimidating looking object. And you can see that on the right here, what is a 7 Tesla MRI scanner. So why would we want to use this? Well, like all medical imaging modalities, MRI is non-invasive, meaning that, like I mentioned previously, you don't have to cut someone open or do anything invasive to use it. But what makes MRI really special is that you get really nice contrast in soft tissues like the organs inside our body. So some examples of what MRI is very good at is in the brain, you have gray and white matter, and you can really delineate the differences in MRI using with its soft tissue contrast. You can also see very clearly the differences between tumors and healthy tissue. And you can also see changes in your musculoskeletal system. So, for example, tears in tendons or things like this for sports injury. And these kind of really nice details of soft tissue aren't true for other modalities. So for example, in ultrasound, you don't really get such beautiful contrast like you do in MRI. And then another really important thing about MRI is that it doesn't have what's called ionizing radiation, which might have long-term effects on a patient if they have too much. And these long-term effects could even cause things like cancer. So with modalities that are also still important, like nuclear medicine or X-ray or CT, you want to limit the amount that you have those, because those actually do have ionizing radiation, but MRI does not have it. So that's another really great thing about this type of modality. So MRI also has the reputation for being really complicated, but I'm hoping today we can talk a little bit about how it works and kind of break it down into something that's easily digestible. So this is the cutout of an MRI scanner, and it has some different items labeled on there, but it really works based on three major components. So the first one is the main magnet, which produces the really strong magnetic field. And that is also what makes up the big majority of that donut shape that you see when you look at an MRI scanner. That shape is also called the bore of the magnet, the center part that you enter. Also, that a really important part for creating an MR image are these gradient coils, which are also encapsulated in that bore of the magnet. And then finally are the radio frequency or RF coils, which are also sometimes in the bore of the magnet. And those radio frequency coils can also be a separate device that is attached to the table of the scanner with the patient. So we'll talk about how each of these components contribute to making an MR image. And in conjunction, they're all critical for imaging. So first, there's the main magnetic field. And what that does is it affects water in your body. And maybe you're aware, but the majority of the components of which we're made, we're very filled with water as humans. And that's what we kind of leverage to be able to create an MR image. So basically, we have this large magnet and it's extremely strong, and it uses superconducting electricity to be able to produce a very strong magnetic field. And actually, when you talk about the strength in MRI, it's normally something like 1.5 or 3 Tesla. And to put that into context, we all might be aware that the Earth has a magnetic field, but the common MRI scanner that we might see in a clinic is actually on the order of 100,000 times stronger than the Earth's magnetic field. So very, very strong superconducting magnet, it's called. And what this does is when you put somebody inside the MRI machine with such a strong magnet, it causes all this water, or actually the hydrogen atoms in the water, to align in the same direction as the main magnetic field. You can might have seen an example before when you have like a common refrigerator magnet and you have some iron filaments, and if you put the magnet close to the iron filaments, it causes them all to align in the same direction. This is kind of what's happening on a global scale with the hydrogen in your body when you enter an MRI machine. But it's completely benign. It's just a nice way to kind of orient everything so that we can begin thinking about producing an MR signal or an MR image in total. So the next component are these gradient coils, which I mentioned. Those are also inside the bore of the magnet. And the gradient coils are 3 different types for 3 different orientations, and they allow us to localize and determine where our MRI signal is coming from, and allows us to kind of recreate an image. And we typically use them to orient scans in one of 3 planes. So these are the axial, this dimension, coronal, which is this dimension, or the sagittal planes that are shown in the diagrams here. And how it kind of works, to be a little bit more specific, is they create some linear variation in one of those 3 dimensions, so X, Y, or Z. And that variation is kind of creating an encoding method for us to be able to say, because of the linear variation at this point, we know that the signal comes from this location. So that's what gradient coils are really important for. If we didn't have them, we would just get a big jumble of signals and not really be able to map it to the image that we eventually create for MRI. The final component that I mentioned were radio frequency or RF coils. And those are really important for generating this signal that I'm talking about that we use to create an MR image. So as I kind of mentioned previously, we have our main magnetic field, and that has already aligned all the hydrogen atoms in our body along the same direction. But now we need them to do something so that we can measure a signal. That's where the RF coil comes in. So basically, the RF coil excites, or it kind of knocks off all of the hydrogen atoms in our body. And that's a process that's called RF transmission. And when it does this excitation, it pushes temporarily the hydrogen atoms into a different plane, but because the main magnetic field is really strong, those atoms really want to get back to the direction of the main magnetic field. And as they do so, they act in a method that is called precession, which is kind of like the way that a top spins. This precession allows the hydrogen atoms to try to get and align back up to the main magnetic field direction. So if we look at this GIF right here, we see it happening in real time, what this magnetic precession is. So in the very beginning of the demonstration, the hydrogen atom, or this arrow it's kind of being represented as, is down and being knocked away and excited by this RF pulse that's generated from the RF coil. But then very quickly it wants to get back up to its main direction. And so it spins kind of like a reverse top in that precession method back up to the main magnetic field. And as it does this spinning, it produces a signal that we can measure to create our MR image. And the signal that's associated with that precession is shown on that left squiggly line diagram. And the whole collection of that signal after we've excited is the second job of the RF coil, and that's called reception. So RF coils themselves, like I mentioned, can be in the bore of the magnet, but they can also be separate attachments to the scanner and dedicated to a particular body part, MRI field strength, or some sort of clinical application. So here I have two examples of RF coils that are really placed on the area of the body that they want to receive the signal from. So we have a cardiac chest coil and also a knee coil as two RF coil examples here. So putting all those pieces together, we need to create an MR image. And we do this through some coordination between the main magnetic field and the gradients in the RF coils in what's called a pulse sequence. So here's an example diagram of a pulse sequence. Might look a little bit confusing, but what it's doing is it's telling us how we time and apply our gradients in our RF pulses, and in such a way that we create our signal. Here it's kind of shown as what's called an echo that produces the meaningful contrast or resolution that we're looking for. And it also, the timing of this also kind of tells us a little bit how long that particular MRI scan time is going to be. So we have this sequence, but in reality, a normal MRI scan will have many pulse sequences. And the reason why we have many pulse sequences is because with different variations of this timing, we can create different types of images that have different clinical applications. So here on the bottom, I'm showing the example of the same human brain, but it has different pulse sequences applied, so it creates different contrasts. And that might have a different meaning for a particular diagnostic assessment. So for example, on the left, this is what we call a T1 weighted image, and then a different type of contrast in the center, T2 weighted. And then on the far right, it's called a flare, which is actually used to suppress any signal that we get from the fluid that we have in our brain and just show tissue. So all in all, this is a little bit how MRI works, and I'm just going to take you really quickly through some of the historical landmarks in the use of clinical MRI, and it eventually gets us to a point where we have what's called 7 Tesla MRI. So previously I had referred to kind of clinical field strengths of 1.5 and 3 Tesla, but we actually even have something super high field strength as 7 Tesla for clinical imaging that you'll hear a little bit more about today as well. So MRI as an imaging method kind of began in 1973 when Paul Lauterbur in New York first created an MR image. And not too long after that, actually, the first whole body MRI scanner was developed here in Scotland in Aberdeen by John Mallard. Also that year, the first MRI scanner was approved for the FDA in the US, and that was done by Phonar Corporation. And then also not too long after that, in 1984, the first MRI scanner was installed here in Glasgow, and that was actually at the Southern General Hospital, now where the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital is, and at the time it was only 0.15 Tesla. So if you fast forward more than 30 years, we get to the point of 2017, a very important year, because that was when the FDA and the CE organizations approved 7 Tesla clinical MRI. And actually that same year, we had the installation of the 7 Tesla MRI scanner here in Glasgow at the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital Imaging Center of Excellence, where I work. So I won't tell you too much about the main clinical benefits of 7 Tesla MRI because that will be discussed even more just in a bit. But I just wanted to show you an example, one of the first 7 Tesla MRI images that we collected here in Glasgow compared to more common clinical field strength of 3 Tesla. So on the left, we have our 7 Tesla image, and on the right, we have our 3 Tesla. And what you can immediately appreciate is how much more detail you get of these blood vessels in the brain with 7 Tesla MRI. So that's a little bit of a preview, but we'll talk a bit more about that in just our next talk as well. So I hope I was able to kind of cover how MRI works today. It's some complicated physics, but if you do it smartly, you get these beautiful images that have real diagnostic potential. If you were unsure about anything and wanted to ask a few extra questions, please feel free to write me. My email is down here on the bottom of the screen. And thanks very much for coming today.
That was perfect.
Good.
That was brilliant. It read really, like it sounded really good. Are you comfortable with that take, or do you want to take another one?
I lost my words at some point, but I honestly don't know that I could do it again and not make similar mistakes.
Yeah.
With that, yeah, that's fine.
Okay, cool. No, it was really good. A good sign is that I don't come from a medical background and I'm not working on any imaging project at the moment. This is new to me and I managed to follow along perfectly.
Oh, that's good. Good.
So that's a really good sign. It's really impressive that you see the differences with the 7T and the 3T, the last image.
Yeah. I guess, maybe it's not I've been told by the radiographers that maybe it's not the fairest comparison for 3 Tesla, but it really is true that like you do get a lot better signal to ratio and resolution. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Natasha is giving a talk. Yeah, so I didn't want to step on her toes because she really has like the knowledge to give a lot more of this discussion. So I knew that she'll cover more of these dramatic with real clinical data soon. So
no, but it's great, and it's so nice to manage to link back to Glasgow and the Queen Elizabeth Hospital. It was perfect, just what we need. So like from that level of keeping someone engaged so that they like the talk and want to stay, this was perfect.
Okay, good. I'm glad.
So really, really good. I'm going to stop the recording now.